Hello, everyone. Welcome to Durrett's Take Today on a wonderful Tuesday. Let's get started. So, I want to talk about mostly the NFL today. So, what I want to talk about is the NFL schedule. So, as you know, the NFL schedule is still going to come out as normal at the end of the week this week instead of delaying it. And I gotta say, I love this move by the NFL. And the NFL, I've been impressed with ever since this pandemic on how they've handled things. For example, a lot of people said that they didn't want to have free agency, that should be pushed back. And Roger Goodell's like, no, I'll do what I want. So we had free agency, and it ended up being successful because that was basically the only thing that was going on. And so it gave us something to look forward to. Then came the NFL draft, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, you need to push away the draft. We can't have the draft right now. It's not going to work out." And Roger Goodell's like, "No, I'll do what I want." So Roger Goodell has the draft and ends up being very successful. It was something that we can look forward to, and also had um, record-breaking viewership numbers. So it ended up working out, and it was a wonderful event, and I loved it. And now this, instead of postponing the NFL schedule because we don't even know if we're going to have an NFL season or not, things are going to go on as planned. Now they're not going to have any international games, but that's expected, and that's fine. We don't need any international games, but the schedule is going to come out at the end of this week and everything like normal. And I love that Roger Goodell is doing this, and I hope that all the other sports are seeing what the NFL is doing, and I hope they apply it to their leagues. Because what the NFL is doing is that they're continuing to do what they want to do, unless if they can't, like unless it's absolutely essential that they can't do it. So I know the WNBA had their draft recently, but with all the other sports, the lesson can be learned here if you want to be a good business. So if if the other sports want to have a good business, they need to produce. Um, they need to produce whether it's a match or an event or something like that. Like unless if they literally can't do it, unless if it's just too difficult, then that's fine. But if there's something like a draft or something along those lines that could be done within the other sports leagues, then they can go ahead and push forward and do it. Because with these events that the NFL is doing, it's been something that we've been looking forward to because there's been no sports for a while, and it ends up being a huge success. So, so I love it. So again, I love what the NFL is doing. So as you know, we've had the NFL draft recently, and I want to share with you who I think passed and failed in the NFL draft. Most of the teams passed, about two-thirds of the team at least passed. So if you failed, that means you sucked, in my opinion. But let's get started. So one of the teams that has passed is the Baltimore Ravens. I love the linebacker that they got from LSU, and then they got the running back Dobbins from Ohio State in the early second round. So they got two really good picks there to already loaded team. The Ravens are going to be one of the best teams in the league this season. So the next team that's passed is the Browns. They addressed an offensive line need, and they got a tackle. They got a pretty good tackle, and then they got a steal. They got the safety Delpit from LSU in the early second round, which he could have been a first round pick. So that was a good pick for them. So again, the Browns had a pretty good draft, and they get a passing grade. The Cowboys have also passed, and the reason why they passed is because when C.D. Lamb failed and then they took him, because instead of drafting to their needs, like drafting a corner or a safety, they drafted the best player available at that slot, which was C.D. Lamb. So I'm proud of them, and they got their corners and safeties in the second and later rounds, anyways. So I love what the Cowboys did there. They had a good draft. Another team that had a good draft was the Minnesota Vikings. They got the Jefferson, the wide receiver from LSU. I'm surprised he fell that far, but they got him, and then they got a bunch of defensive pieces to help replace some defensive stars that left for other teams. So the Vikings should be good. Another team that passed was the Cardinals because they got Isaiah Simmons, one of the best players in the draft that fell all the way back to 8. So that helps the Cardinals a lot. Um, Another team that drafted well was the Bengals. They got Burrow, obviously. They got the wide receiver from Clemson, Higgins, early in the second round. And since they drafted an offensive lineman that they needed last year, but he never played due to injury, he's going to be starting this year. So it's like basically three first rounders going to be starting this year for the Bengals. So the Bengals are going to look way better than normal. Um, Another team that passed was actually the Jaguars. Now I know the Jaguars appear to be tanking, but they've drafted a bunch of good defensive players that they've replaced. So since they're all going to be rookies, that's why they're doing this. Like I said, over time, those defensive players can come pretty good. So again, under the radar, but secretly they had a pretty good draft. Another team that had a pretty good draft was the Dolphins, mainly because of all the picks that they have. It's hard to screw that up. So they got an offensive lineman they needed, got some other pieces, and most importantly, they got their quarterback of the future, hopefully in Tua. Another team that had a passing grade is the Lions. They drafted an excellent corner from Ohio State, and they just got a bunch of other good skill position players to help them out, to help the offense out. So I like what they did. Another team that drafted well was the 49ers. They got their defensive tackle to replace Forrest Buckner, who got traded to the Indianapolis Colts. They got their first round wide receiver. There to replace Emmanuel Sanders, who left for the Saints. So they got the pieces that they needed. So they should be basically the same team they were last year. The Buccaneers had a good draft. They got a pretty good tackle to help protect Brady, and then they got some defensive pieces as well. So again, good draft there. The Jets, they passed, but in my opinion, they barely passed. So they got a pretty good offensive tackle, but other than that, nothing really stood out to them. So because the offensive tackle is really what they needed, because the Jets' offensive line is horrible, that really will make it somewhat of a difference if that offensive tackle ends up being good or not. But again, in my opinion, they kind of just barely passed. Another team that drafted well was the Carolina Panthers. They drafted all their draft picks from the defensive side of the ball, which is what was a struggle for them last year. So now hopefully the Panthers can get a little bit better on defense because their offense got better in the offseason. So the Panthers are going to be a sneaky team. The Broncos had a good draft. Surprisingly, Jerry Jeudy fell all the way down to them, so they were able to get him. And then they also drafted a wide receiver from Penn State in the second round. And wide receiver was their biggest need, so they got two really good wide receivers in the draft. So now their offense should be much improved if Drew Lock continues to progress. Another team that drafted well was the Indianapolis Colts. They got a bunch of skill position players like the wide receiver Pittman from USC. They got, I feel like, the best running back in the draft, and Jonathan Taylor from Wisconsin. They also got their QB of the future, most likely, and Jacob Eason from Washington at a steal in the fourth round because a lot of people projected he was going to be a second rounder. So that was a good move for the Colts. Another team that drafted well is the Saints. It's not flashy per se, but they got a center that they needed, and they got a steal linebacker in the third round. They just didn't have a lot of picks, but with the few picks that they did have, they made good choices. Another team that did well was the Buffalo Bills. Now they didn't have a first rounder because they got Stephon Diggs, which is a good get. But with the other players they got a bunch of underrated players that don't jump out. But since I've watched them in college football, I know they can be pretty good in NFL. So that's why I say the Bills passed. Another team that passed, in my opinion, is the Redskins. They got the best player in the draft in Chase Young, and then they got a good cornerback from LSU, and just got some good other pieces as well. So again, I like what the Redskins did. The Raiders had a pretty good draft, in my opinion. They got a bunch of new weapons for Derek Carr. So now we're gonna know if the Raiders fail next season, we're gonna know it's Derek Carr, not the offense, because John Gruden got him a bunch of weapons after this draft. Another team that passed barely in my mind was the Kansas City Chiefs. I like the running back that they got from the first round and a linebacker from Mississippi State to make their defense even better. But again, they didn't have a lot of picks, and the other picks that they do have weren't flashy, so that's why they barely passed. And then the last team that passed, in my opinion, was the Chargers. They got Herbert, who could either be a bust or a success, but I feel like he'll be just fine in the NFL. And then they trade up to get a linebacker from Oklahoma in the first round to help their linebacking core. And they got a bunch of other underrated wide receivers to make their wide receiver core even better and help out their QB. So now for the losers, I want to start off with the Falcons. The first round pick from Clemson was a decent pick, but otherwise none of the other picks jumped out to me. It was kind of a very boring draft for the Falcons, if you will. Another team that failed was the Giants. So the fourth pick, they could have gone two directions. They could have either picked the best offensive tackle by most people, including me, in the draft, or they could have gone Isaiah Simmons for the defense because he's such a talented player. Either or would have been understandable, but instead they chose an offensive lineman that was probably like the third best offensive lineman in the draft, and they had the fourth pick, so they could have had their choices of any one of them. So I just didn't like that by the Giants. And, the Rams, their running back choice was interesting because I feel like there was other running backs on the table that was better. Um, I'm surprised that they got him. So I don't think he'll be able to replace Gurley, the running back from Florida State. The main thing is they also needed a lot of offensive line help because their offensive line wasn't the greatest last year, and they didn't even draft offensive linemen until the seventh round. So I didn't like what they did. The next is the Eagles. I know a lot of people are calling out the Eagles for taking Jalen Hurts, and for me, I actually am one of those people that doesn't agree with it. Even if you do use him in a Taysom Hill role, which is valuable, the second rounder is still kind of costly. You can do what the Saints did and draft a Taysom Hill like player in the seventh round. Therefore, you don't have to pay him much, and he's not. You don't have to spend too much for him. So there you go. That's why I would have done if I were the Eagles. Um, but but maybe if Jalen Hurts ends up being like a Lamar Jackson or something like that, if he ends up starting at some point, if Wentz gets injured once again, then of course the Eagles end up being right. But I don't like what they did there. But also the thing I didn't like even more was their first round pick. They got a wide receiver from TCU, and he wasn't even the best wide receiver available. There were other better wide receivers that they could have gotten. Like an example, the one that went to the Minnesota Vikings from LSU. So I'm just surprised that the Eagles' first two choices. Another team that I thought made an interesting choice was the Chicago Bears. So they didn't have a lot of draft picks, but when they got their first draft pick in the second round, it was for a tight end, which they already have a bunch of tight ends on their squad that including Jimmy Graham. So I was just so confused on why they did that. Um, and they wonder why and they wonder why Trubisky is not working out in Chicago. It's because they can't draft well. Another team that did bad was the Texans. Now they barely had any picks at all because of trades and stuff like that. But even the few picks that they got, I don't like it. But that's Bill O'Brien for you. Another team that I thought didn't do well was the Seahawks. They didn't get the best linebacker, in my opinion, that was on the board. So, so that guy was Queen. He went to the Ravens, so they could have got him. But instead, they got so for the linebacker from Texas Tech. Um, they also drafted a bunch of names I've never heard before. And since I'm a college football fan, I watch college football a lot. I know a lot of names from college football, and if I don't recognize them, and if I don't remember them making an impact, then that should tell you something on who they drafted. Another team's the Steelers. They drafted to their needs. Just not sure if the players that they drafted to their needs are going to be game changers. I don't. In my opinion, if they will take time, but I don't think they will be. Also, I feel like they should have drafted a quarterback, whether it was Jalen Hurts or Jacob Eason or whatever, just because we know the backup situation in Pittsburgh is not good, and I'm not sure if Big Ben is going to be healthy or not. But that's just my choice there. Another team is the Packers. Now if Love ends up being a Super Bowl champion or annual Pro Bowler, then all is forgiven here. But if not, then this was a waste of a first round pick, especially when they needed to draft a wide receiver, and they didn't even draft a wide receiver throughout the whole draft, which the wide receivers were loaded in this draft. So I just do not get the Packers whatsoever. That was just confusing to me. I don't get it. But if the Packers end up once again losing in the early playoffs or even not making the playoffs, then Aaron Rodgers should demand a trade. That's what I would do if I were him. Last team is the Patriots. So they did not get a QB in this draft. When they could have taken Jordan Love at the taking, he was right there, but they didn't take him. And they also didn't draft a wide receiver, which is what they really need. As you saw, Tom Brady's 11th last year sucked. So, in my opinion, I feel like you shouldn't be surprised if the Patriots are under 500 this year, unless Stidham's for some reason is an amazing quarterback, but I doubt it. So the Patriots, while they won't admit it, they can easily end up being taken. They can easily end up tanking to try to get Trevor Lawrence next year. Again, unless the James deal works out. But yeah, just not a very good draft by them. So these are my pass and fail teams of the draft, and I want to thank y'all for tuning in today. Remember to leave comments what you want me to talk about in the future, likes and dislikes, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you very much.